Judge Samuel Thompson sat at the front of the small courtroom with his usual calm demeanor, his eyes scanning the room as he listened to the steady hum of voices echoing against the walls. It was another ordinary morning in Oak Ridge, with a long list of cases to get through, but something about this day felt different. The sound of the door opening interrupted his thoughts, and he looked up to see a young woman walk in. She stood tall with a quiet confidence, her dark eyes focused ahead. As she walked to the defendant's bench, her name was Jada Moore, and she was here for a minor traffic violation, a simple case that he expected to be over in minutes. But as she stood before him, he couldn't help but notice something in her presence, something familiar. He cleared his throat and glanced at the file in front of him. Jada Moore had been pulled over for speeding and failing to signal when changing lanes, nothing out of the ordinary. But as he looked at her again, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen those eyes before. There was something about her that tugged at the back of his mind, the shape of her face, the way her hair fell around her shoulders, the curve of her smile. It all seemed so familiar, but from where? Java stood quietly as Judge Thompson spoke, her gaze fixed on the floor, her hands clasped in front of her, her mind racing with thoughts of her grandmother's advice to always keep your head down in situations like this. Don't attract attention, don't make waves. But it was hard to stay calm in front of a judge who seemed so imposing, his voice steady and authoritative as he asked her questions about the circumstances of the violation. Jada's answers were simple enough. She explained that she had been in a hurry to get to work that morning and hadn't noticed the speed limit had dropped until it was too late. She had no excuse for not signaling, but she was sorry and would be more careful in the future. Judge Thompson listened carefully as she spoke, his expression neutral, but his mind still racing. He studied her features again, her eyes, her posture, and for a moment he felt something in his gut, a connection, something he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. It was as if he had seen her before, or at least someone who looked exactly like her. He shook off the thought and focused back on the case. This was a simple matter. A fine would be appropriate, he decided, but something about Jada made him pause. He looked at her more intently, his voice softened just a little as he delivered the verdict, a fine and a warning to be more mindful in the future. But as he handed down the decision, he couldn't help but notice the way she looked at him. There was something in her gaze, something that made his chest tighten just a bit. The moment passed quickly, and Jada left the courtroom without a word. She didn't protest or argue, she simply nodded and walked out. But as she stepped through the door, Judge Thompson sat back in his chair, still unable to shake the strange feeling that lingered in the air, as if fate had just placed a piece of the puzzle in front of him. But he couldn't quite figure out where it fit. He stared at the empty doorway for a moment before turning his attention back to the next case, his mind still reeling from the encounter with Jada Moore. That evening, Judge Samuel Thompson sat alone in his study, surrounded by the quiet hum of his house, as the light from the desk lamp flickered gently over the papers scattered in front of him. He had planned to work on some legal briefs, but his mind kept wandering back to the case earlier in the day. The image of Jada Moore's face lingered in his thoughts like a faint memory. He couldn't quite place it. Had been a routine case, yet something about it felt different, more significant than he could explain. He ran his fingers through his graying hair, trying to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't leave him alone. Her eyes kept flashing in his mind, those deep brown eyes that seemed so familiar, like he had seen them before. It was as if they were a mirror into a past he had long since forgotten. But it wasn't just her eyes, it was her whole presence. There was a quiet strength about her, something that tugged at his heart in a way he hadn't expected. He had dealt with countless defendants in his years on the bench, but none of them had made him feel this way. After a long silence, he stood up from his desk and walked over to the bookshelf, lined with old family albums and dusty files. The worn leather of the spine creaked as he pulled out an old photo album his grandmother had given him years ago. He hadn't opened it in ages, but tonight it felt like the right time. As he flipped through the pages, his fingers brushed against the edges of each photo. He came across pictures of his parents, his cousins, his extended family, faces he hadn't seen in years, some of the people he barely remembered. But he stopped on one page where the black and white photos seemed to blur together. A picture of a young woman stood out to him. She had a striking smile and dark eyes that seemed to glow from the photograph. Her name was Evelyn Thompson, and she was his aunt. As he studied the photo, a strange feeling washed over him. Evelyn had been his father's half-sister, and the family had always been tight-lipped about her disappearance years ago. It was one of those family stories that had never been fully explained, and over time, it faded into the background of their history. But now, as he stared at the photo, he couldn't help but notice the resemblance between Evelyn and Jada Moore, her smile, the curve of her cheekbones, the way her eyes held a certain depth. It was uncanny. His heart skipped a beat as his mind raced through the possibility he had never considered before. Could Jada Moore be related to him? Could she be the child of Evelyn, the aunt his family had lost track of so many years ago? The thought was both shocking and exciting, yet at the same time unsettling. How could it be possible after all these years? Judge Thompson's pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of the sudden connection he had to Jada Moore. Was it all just a coincidence? Or was fate pulling him into a story from the past that he never thought would resurface? He closed the album and placed it back on the shelf, his mind now swirling with questions that wouldn't be easily answered. He knew he had to find out more about Jada to confirm his suspicions, but he didn't know where to start. He had never been one to pry into other people's lives. But something about this felt different. Something about Jada felt like a puzzle piece he couldn't ignore. The weight of the unknown settled on him as he sat back down at his desk, his eyes drifting to the empty chair across from him, where Jada Moore had sat just hours earlier. Judge Samuel Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply significant about Jada Moore, something that had been hidden for years. The thought of his lost Aunt Evelyn, the woman who had vanished from his family's life, gnawed at him. Evelyn had been a beautiful, independent spirit, a woman who'd made her own choices and had faced the consequences of them in a time when society wasn't always kind to women who dared to stray from convention. His father had always been distant when it came to discussing her, and the more questions Samuel asked growing up, the less he was told. Evelyn had simply disappeared, and the family had moved on as though she had never existed. Now, with Jada Moore's case hanging in the air, something stirred deep within him. A need to understand, to uncover what had been buried for so long. He sat in his study that night, staring at the photo of his aunt, her youthful face radiating from the pages. He ran his fingers over the glass frame, feeling the coolness of the smooth surface. Could Jada be connected to Evelyn? The resemblance was too strong to ignore, but what was the link? The next day, Samuel decided to take the first step in his quest for answers. He knew it wouldn't be easy to ask questions about a family that had been torn apart by secrets, but he was determined. He reached out to his aunt's old friends, people who had known her well before she left Oak Ridge. The responses he got were less than helpful, mostly vague recollections of a woman who had a complicated life, one marked by rumors and misunderstandings. He kept pressing, though, following threads from one conversation to the next, until he finally spoke to a woman named Margie, a childhood friend of Evelyn's. Margie, now in her late 70s, was reluctant at first to open up, but after a little coaxing, she finally gave in. She confirmed that Evelyn had once been involved with a man named Walter Moore, a man who had come from a different town, a man whose family was known for their deep roots in the community. According to Margie, Evelyn had fallen in love with him, but the relationship had been complicated from the start. Walter had been married at the time, and when Evelyn found herself pregnant, everything became more difficult. Margie's voice dropped to a whisper as she continued, revealing that the couple had fought bitterly before Evelyn disappeared. She mentioned that after Evelyn left, Walter's family had distanced themselves from her entirely. Suddenly, it all clicked. Jada Moore wasn't just a random defendant in his courtroom. She was connected to this tangled web of family history. She was Evelyn's daughter, born of a love that had been buried by time and secrets. Samuel's heart raced as he sat back in his chair, absorbing the weight of this revelation. He had been living in the shadow of a family history he didn't fully understand, and now it was all coming to light in the most unexpected way. He spent the rest of the day in a haze, reflecting on the conversation with Margie. Jada Moore was a part of him, a part of a family that had been fractured long ago. But the question remained, why had Jada never known about her true family? What had happened to her mother? Samuel didn't have the answers yet, but he knew he couldn't ignore the pull of the past any longer. The mystery of his Aunt Evelyn, the disappearance, and now Jada's involvement was a story that had to be told. That night, he wrote down everything he had learned so far, everything that seemed to be falling into place. Tomorrow, he would take the next step. He would seek out Jada and ask her to meet. There was still so much left to uncover, but Samuel couldn't help but feel that their fates were now intertwined. The next morning, Judge Samuel Thompson sat in his office, a folder full of notes on his desk, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He had spent the last few hours piecing together what little information he had about Jada Moore's family, but something in the pit of his stomach told him this wasn't just about the past. There was a deeper connection, a bond that couldn't be ignored. He had already taken the first step by reaching out to his aunt's old friend, Margie, and learning about Jada's possible lineage, but now he had to meet Jada herself. He couldn't simply keep turning the pages of this family mystery from behind his desk. He had to face it head-on. He hesitated as he picked up the phone. The call wasn't going to be easy. What would he even say to her? "Hi, Jada. I think you might be my long-lost cousin." It sounded absurd even to him. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that this wasn't a coincidence. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and he needed to find out if there was something more to their connection. Taking a deep breath, he dialed Jada's number. The phone rang for a few moments before she picked up. Her voice, calm and professional, greeted him. "Hello, this is Jada Moore." "Hello, Jada," Samuel said, his voice steady but betraying a hint of unease. "This is Judge Samuel Thompson. I know we've met briefly in court, but I was hoping we could have a conversation." There was a pause on the other end. Samuel could almost hear her weigh his words, deciding whether or not to trust him. "Sure, Judge Thompson. What's this about? I know this may sound strange, but there's something important I need to ask you. I'd like to meet in person. Can we set up a time to talk?" Jada was quiet for a moment before agreeing. "All right, I'll be free tomorrow afternoon. Where would you like to meet?" "Let's meet at the cafe downtown at 3 p.m. I'll be there." The line went silent as Jada confirmed the time before hanging up. Samuel stared at the phone in his hand, feeling a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Tomorrow would be the day when everything would come to light or fall apart. He couldn't predict which way it would go, but he had to know. The next afternoon, Samuel arrived early at the cafe, his heart beating faster than he expected. He took a seat at a small table by the window, watching as people passed by. The quaint little cafe was quiet at this hour, the perfect place for a conversation like the one he was about to have. He fidgeted with his napkin, trying to calm his racing thoughts. What if Jada didn't believe him? What if she was just as skeptical as he had been when he first pieced the puzzle together? At exactly 3 p.m., the door chimed as Jada walked in. She looked around briefly before her eyes settled on Samuel. She didn't smile, but she nodded as she approached the table, taking a seat across from him without saying a word. "Thank you for meeting with me," Samuel began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know this is unusual, but I need to talk to you about something that's come up, something related to your family." Jada raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her gaze sharp, waiting for him to continue. "I've been doing some research into my family history, and I believe we may be related," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, unsure how to soften the shock of his words. Jada's expression didn't change, but her lips pressed together in a firm line. "Related?" she asked, her tone cautious but curious. "Yes, your mother, Evelyn Thompson. She was my aunt," Samuel explained, watching her closely for any reaction. "I believe you're her daughter, which would make us cousins." Jada stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath as she processed his words. Then quietly, she asked, "How do you know this?" Samuel leaned in slightly, determined to help her understand. "I've been piecing things together, talking to people who knew her. It all leads back to you, Jada, and I believe that, somehow, fate has brought us together." Jada's gaze softened, though she still didn't speak. She was absorbing the weight of what he had just said, trying to connect the dots in her own mind. Samuel could see the wheels turning, the confusion and disbelief battling against a growing sense of recognition. This wasn't going to be easy for either of them, but it was a beginning. a beginning of answers to questions neither of them had fully understood until now. Jada sat in stunned silence, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The world around her seemed to blur for a moment, the quiet hum of the cafe fading as she processed Samuel Thompson's words. Her mother had never spoken about her past, about family, about where she came from. All she had ever known was the quiet strength of her grandmother, who had raised her in a small town far from the bustle of Oak Ridge. Now, sitting across from a man who claimed to be her cousin, Jada felt a mixture of emotions swirling inside her: disbelief, confusion, and a strange sense of connection she couldn't quite explain. "You're telling me that Evelyn Thompson was your aunt?" Jada asked, her voice soft but firm. Her brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of the sudden revelation. "But my mom, she never talked about any of her family. Why would she keep something like this a secret?" Samuel nodded, his expression empathetic but resolute. "I understand your confusion. I grew up with stories of my aunt, but those stories were always vague. She disappeared from our family when I was young. No one ever talked about her after that. But everything I've learned lately about your mother, your family, seems to point to a connection between us." Jada leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Evelyn Thompson, her mother's name, a name she had never heard growing up, was suddenly not just a name on a distant family tree. It was a key to understanding the rift she had always felt in her own life. Her grandmother had told her very little about her mother's past, always brushing it aside with vague stories about a difficult time and a woman who chose to leave. The silence had always felt heavy, but she had never pushed for more. Now in this quiet cafe, everything was beginning to unravel. "How do you know all this?" Jada asked, still not sure whether to believe him. "Why did you think I was connected to your family?" Samuel hesitated, his eyes darkening as he explained. "I've spent years hearing bits and pieces about my Aunt Evelyn, how she had a relationship with a man named Walter Moore, a man with a family here in Oak Ridge. And when I saw you in my courtroom yesterday, I couldn't shake the feeling that you looked so much like her." I asked around, spoke to a few people who remembered her. One of them mentioned her name in connection with a man named Moore, and that's when the pieces started falling into place. "I believe you're Evelyn's daughter, Jada." Jada's breath caught in her throat. The name Walter Moore resonated in her mind, though she couldn't place why. She had heard her grandmother speak of a Walter in the passing, but it had always been in the context of a painful past, something Jada was never fully privy to. Now, the fragments of family history were being forced into view, and the truth was more complicated than she could have imagined. "Wait," she said, her voice low and thoughtful. "If my mom was your aunt, and you're really my cousin, why didn't anyone ever tell me about this? Why did my mom keep this from me?" Samuel sighed deeply, his gaze flickering with an unreadable emotion. "I don't have all the answers, Jada. I wish I did. All I know is that my Aunt Evelyn's disappearance caused a lot of pain for my family. There were whispers about betrayal, about secrets, about things no one was willing to confront. I don't know why your mother chose to keep her past hidden from you, but I think part of her may have been trying to protect you from a legacy that wasn't easy to understand. But now, I think it's time we uncover the truth together." Jada stared at him, her mind grappling with everything he had said. Her whole life she had felt a sense of disconnection, as if something fundamental was missing. She had grown up with a grandmother who loved her dearly but never shared stories of her own history, a mother who had kept her past locked away in silence. Now, the stranger, a judge who had sentenced her to a fine just the day before, was telling her that the past she had never known was part of her own story. She didn't know whether to feel angry, betrayed, or relieved. Perhaps all of those things at once. "I don't know what to say," Jada admitted quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I need time to process all of this. I don't even know where to start." Samuel nodded, his face softening. "I understand, Jada. This is a lot to take in. But I want you to know that I'm here, and I want to help you understand everything. Whatever you need, I'll be there." For the first time since the conversation began, Jada's eyes softened, and she allowed herself to feel the smallest glimmer of hope. Perhaps this discovery, as overwhelming as it was, could offer the chance for a new beginning. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she had always believed. But as the cafe grew quieter around them, Jada couldn't help but feel that the road ahead would be one filled with more questions than answers. It wasn't just about the past, it was about what she would do with this new knowledge and how it would shape her future. "Thank you for telling me this," Jada said, her voice steady now, even if her heart was still uncertain. "I'll think about everything. I'll need time to figure it all out." Samuel smiled, a rare expression of warmth crossing his face. "Take all the time you need. Just know that you're not alone in this." As they both stood up, the weight of the past settling between them, Jada couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. The days following her meeting with Judge Samuel Thompson felt like a blur to Jada. She had left the cafe with more questions than answers, her mind overwhelmed with everything she had learned. The discovery that she might be the daughter of Evelyn Thompson, the woman who had disappeared from Samuel's family so many years ago, had shaken the very foundation of her life. For as long as she could remember, her family had been a quiet, insular unit. Her grandmother had raised her with love, but there had always been a sense that something was missing, something unsaid, buried deep within the walls of their home. Now she was starting to uncover the buried truths that had eluded her for so long. Jada spent the following days grappling with the revelation. She sought solace in her apartment, trying to piece together what little she knew of her mother's past. Her grandmother had passed away 2 years ago, taking with her the last of the stories and fragments about her own history. Jada had always assumed her mother's silence was simply out of personal choice, a result of a painful past she didn't want to relive. But now, after hearing Samuel's words and the connection to her aunt Evelyn, the silence felt different. It felt like a shield, something her mother had built to protect herself from a world that had been cruel and unforgiving. One evening, unable to sleep, Jada pulled out a box of old letters and photographs that her grandmother had kept hidden in a closet. She opened the box carefully, hoping to find something, anything that would help her understand her mother's past. The first few items were familiar: birthday cards, school photos, and the occasional family snapshot. But at the bottom of the box, she found something unexpected: a faded, handwritten letter. It was addressed to "My dearest Evelyn," and as she unfolded the yellowed paper, her heart skipped a beat. It was a letter from her mother, dated years before Jada had been born. The words on the page were written with a rawness that made her chest tighten. Her mother, it seemed, had been reaching out to her estranged family, Samuel's family, trying to reconnect, trying to make amends for the mistakes of the past. The letter spoke of regret, of love, and of a longing for a family that had turned its back on her. The most shocking part of the letter was the final line: "I have a daughter now, and I hope one day she can know the family that I lost." Jada's fingers trembled as she put the letter down, her mind racing. The letter explained so much. Her mother had been trying to find a way back to her family, but the hurt, the distance, and the history had been too much to overcome. It also confirmed what Samuel had said. Her mother had been a part of that family once, a daughter, a sister. And Jada was now standing at the precipice of reclaiming that lost connection, that broken link to a family she had never known. The next day, Jada couldn't stay in her apartment any longer. The weight of the letter, of the history that was unfolding before her, felt too heavy to carry alone. She knew she needed to speak to Samuel again, to confront the truth that was slowly taking shape. She called him and asked if they could meet once more to talk about what came next. They agreed to meet at the same cafe. As Jada walked in, she saw Samuel already seated at their usual table. This time, there was no hesitation in her steps. She approached him, and without waiting for pleasantries, she handed him the letter she had found. Samuel read it quietly, his expression softening as he understood its significance. When he looked up at Jada, there was an unspoken understanding between them. "This confirms everything," he said quietly. "Your mother had reached out. She wanted to reconnect, but she couldn't. She was alone in that decision." Jada nodded, swallowing hard. "I always wondered why she kept everything hidden from me. But I never imagined this." She paused, looking out the window at the world passing by, her thoughts swirling. "I never knew what happened to her family, why she left them behind. I don't know what I should do now, Samuel. Samuel reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers in a comforting gesture. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, but if you want to know more, I'll help you. Your family is here, Jada. You're not alone anymore. The simplicity of his words was like a balm to the rawness she had been feeling. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jada didn't feel like an outsider looking in at a family she had never known. With Samuel's support, the pieces of the past that had always been hidden were beginning to fall into place. But even as hope stirred within her, Jada knew the journey ahead would be complex. There were still unanswered questions about her mother's disappearance, about her own identity, and about how this new family would fit into her life. Yet as she looked across the table at Samuel, she realized that this wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about moving forward toward a future where the silence would finally be broken. The weeks that followed Jada's meeting with Samuel Thompson were a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. With Samuel's encouragement, she began to reconnect the fragmented pieces of her family's history. Every conversation with him felt like peeling back another layer of a deeply buried story, and Jada was determined to learn the truth, even if it meant confronting painful memories. For the first time, she realized that her mother's silence wasn't a rejection of her. It was a reflection of the complex, often painful history she had inherited. One afternoon, as she sorted through more of her grandmother's old belongings, Jada found another surprise: an old photograph album tucked away in a dusty box. The album was filled with pictures of a woman she didn't recognize, a younger version of her mother, Evelyn. Some photos were of her mother as a child, others as a young adult, laughing with friends and family. As Jada flipped through the pages, she saw pictures of a man, Walter Moore, her mother's partner, and a child Jada had never met but knew instantly was her own mother. The photographs were idyllic at first glance, showing a family that looked happy whole. But as Jada turned the pages, she began to notice the subtle shift in the expressions of the people in the photos. The smiles started to fade, the gatherings more sparse. It was as if a turning point had occurred, but no one had ever been willing to speak about it. One photograph in particular caught Jada's eye, a candid shot of her mother and Walter Moore standing together in front of a house. They were holding hands, but Evelyn's smile looked strained, her eyes distant. The photo was undated, but there was something about it that tugged at Jada's heart. It was clear this was before her mother had disappeared, but the unease in Evelyn's expression was unmistakable. Jada sat there for a long time, her mind racing as she thought about the secrets her mother had carried. She wondered what had gone wrong between Evelyn and Walter, what had led her mother to leave everything behind and vanish from Samuel's family's life. It felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to dive into a past that had always seemed so far away. The following week, Samuel invited Jada to meet with him again, but this time, it wasn't just about family history. Samuel had tracked down some of the people who had known Evelyn and Walter during their time together, and he was eager to share what he had learned. When they sat down at the same cafe, Samuel placed a folder in front of her. "I found some more information, Jada," he said quietly. "It's about your mother and Walter. It's not easy to hear, but I think you need to know." Jada opened the folder and her heart dropped. Inside were old newspaper clippings, articles that mentioned Walter Moore's involvement in a scandalous affair, one that had rocked Oak Ridge's social scene at the time. The affair had been with Evelyn, and when it came to light, the community had been in an uproar. Walter, a respected member of the town, had been married, and the affair had torn his family apart. But the most shocking part of the story was how Evelyn had seemingly disappeared after the scandal broke. Jada felt a rush of conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, confusion. The scandal had been devastating for her mother, but it also explained so much: the years of silence, the inability to return to a place that had once been her home. Jada had spent so much time wondering what had happened to her mother, but now she was beginning to understand how deeply hurt Evelyn had been. Samuel watched her closely as she processed the information. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," he said, his voice gentle. "But I think it's important that you understand the full picture. Your mother didn't just leave Oak Ridge because of her own choices. She was forced to walk away from everything she knew because of the scandal. She lost her family, her reputation, and in some ways herself. Jada looked up at him, the weight of the revelation settling on her shoulders. So, she didn't just disappear. She ran away. Samuel nodded. It wasn't just about her relationship with Walter. It was about how her entire world turned upside down. She was trying to protect herself, and you, from a life that had become too toxic to stay in. Jada closed the folder, her mind spinning. She had always known there was more to her mother's story, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Her mother had been a victim of scandal, forced to retreat from a world that had turned on her. I never knew, Jada whispered, feeling the weight of the past pressing in on her chest. I never knew what she went through. Samuel reached across the table, offering her a comforting smile. You don't have to go through this alone, Jada. You have a family here. My family, if you're ready to let us be a part of your life. Jada's throat tightened as she looked at him. The warmth of his offer was a lifeline she hadn't expected. The history was painful, but she no longer felt like an outsider. With Samuel's support, she could begin to rebuild the family ties that had been broken for so long. I want to understand it all, Jada said, her voice determined. I want to know everything about my mother. I want to know my family, my real family. As she left the cafe that afternoon, Jada knew that while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, she was finally on the path to healing. The scars of the past couldn't be erased, but they didn't have to define her future. The days turned into weeks as Jada slowly began to piece together the life her mother, Evelyn, had lived. A life full of secrets, heartache, and lost opportunities. With each new discovery, the weight of her mother's pain became more tangible, and so did the weight of her own responsibility to understand and preserve that history. Samuel had become an invaluable ally in this process, offering his knowledge, his connections, and most importantly, his unwavering support. Jada's relationship with Samuel began to evolve as well. What started as an unexpected, reluctant meeting between a judge and a woman caught in a fine had blossomed into something more. They spent long hours together, discussing Evelyn, their family's past, and the present that tied them together in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Samuel was patient, understanding that Jada's emotions were tangled in a web of confusion and grief. He never pushed her for answers she wasn't ready to give, but always made sure she knew he was there whenever she was ready to confront the next part of her journey. One evening, Samuel invited Jada to dinner at his home, a quiet and warm gathering that included his wife, Karen, and their young daughter, Mia. The invitation was a step in a new direction, a way to integrate Jada into his life, offering her a glimpse of the family she had never known. As they sat at the dinner table, Jada found herself genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks. It wasn't just the delicious food or the easy laughter that filled the room. It was the sense of belonging, the feeling that she was no longer alone in the world. Karen had been kind, asking questions about Jada's life and showing genuine interest in her background, while Mia had warmed to Jada immediately, as if she could sense that their connection was deeper than just a simple family gathering. The evening was a reminder to Jada that she didn't have to carry her burden alone anymore. She had a family now, a family that wanted to know her and to be a part of her life. As the night came to a close, Samuel walked Jada to the door. "You're part of this family now," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "If you ever feel lost or uncertain, you don't have to face it on your own." Jada smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." That night, as she lay in bed, Jada reflected on how far she had come. The pain of discovering her mother's hidden past was still there, but it was no longer a burden that weighed her down. Instead, it had become a part of her story, a chapter she had to face in order to move forward. She had learned that even though her mother's choices had been complicated and painful, Jada was not defined by those choices. She was her own person, with the power to create her future, regardless of the mistakes and regrets of the past. The following week, Jada received a letter in the mail. It was from an attorney in Oak Ridge, one of the few remaining people who had known Evelyn personally. The letter contained an unexpected invitation, a request to meet with Jada regarding her mother's estate. Apparently, Evelyn had left behind some assets, including a small house in Oak Ridge, that Jada had never known about. The letter hinted that there was more to her mother's legacy than Jada had ever realized. As she read the letter, Jada's mind raced. Was this the final piece of the puzzle? Had her mother left her something more than just a family history? Jada knew she had to go to understand fully what Evelyn had left behind and what it meant for her. The next few days were filled with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Jada knew she was standing at crossroads. Whatever she would find in Oak Ridge would shape her future in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. When she arrived at the lawyer's office, the man greeted her with a warm smile. "I'm glad you could make it, Miss Moore," he said. "There's a lot to discuss, and I think you'll be surprised by what your mother left behind." Jada followed him into the office, her heart racing with curiosity. As she took a seat across from the attorney, she felt a sense of closure coming, though she wasn't sure yet what kind. The past was finally catching up with her, and it was time to see where it would lead. In the end, Jada realized that the story she had inherited wasn't just one of loss and betrayal. It was a story of resilience, of family, and of finding strength in the face of adversity. The journey was far from over, but Jada now knew she wasn't walking it alone. The family she had discovered, the ties that had been broken and remade, had given her a new sense of purpose. And with that, she knew she was ready for whatever the future held.